David Howcroft from Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. And Andrzej Duszek will be so kind as to introduce our guest in more detail. Please, Andrzej, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, David Howcroft is a postdoc at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. His focus is on natural language generation. He previously worked on text planning and referring expression generation. He also has some works on text complexity and readability. And most importantly, last year, he published 2 papers that focused on evaluation of natural language generation, on various evaluation methods and their comparison. And these should be the focus of today's talk. So Dave, please, you have the floor.
All right, let me just share the screen now. And with the warning that if my Zoom freezes, since it seems to not always like Linux, then I may have to restart my computer at some point, but it should work. So,
okay.
Let's see. Okay, so you can see my slides now, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Great. So, hi everyone. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm calling in from Scotland today. I'm Dave Howcroft, and yeah, I am excited to present this work to you folks. I kind of tried to smash together the titles of the 2 papers Andre was referring to as well. So this talk is then disentangling this 20 years of confusion and trying to figure out where the heck are we going. So before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of these lovely people. So I have amazing collaborators. I think you all know that the past year has been extremely difficult for everyone. And despite the challenges that everyone has faced, we were able to put together these 2 papers. And I just think that's incredible. It would not have been possible without these people, the various grants and institutions supporting their research. So there's a mix of industry and academia, folks from the US, folks from various bits of Europe. And I'd also like to just briefly highlight my current PI who is supporting me in leading these initiatives as well, Verena Rieser. So really this work would not be possible with these people. So it takes a village, and yeah, it truly has. So today I am talking about human evaluation for natural language generation systems. So I know that there are folks working on NLG at Charles University, but just to put into context the problem as I see it, right? In NLG, evaluation is difficult because we have, from a single input, many possible valid outputs. And so this makes any attempt at automated evaluation extremely difficult. Even if you dramatically increase the number of reference texts that you're comparing to, you still can't capture all of the possible nuance, different nuanced ways of expressing a particular idea, right? So in my work, I've generally focused on data to text. So this is an example from this realm, where we've got a simple sort of slot value pair meaning representation. So here we've got the name of a restaurant, the kind of food it serves, what its rating is. Can you see my mouse cursor as well, by the way? Moving around.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then the part of the town that it's in. That's good to know. That way I don't have to like grab a, like do some funny pointer stuff. So yeah, so this text, we could just say Aromi is a restaurant providing Chinese food. It's located in the city center. Its customer rating is 5 out of 5. We could also say there's a Chinese place in the city center called Aromi with a 5-star rating. And here are a couple of other freebies, you know, other ways you could express this. The point being that these all express the same core content, perhaps with different pragmatic implications in that, but these are valid ways of expressing the same content. And this is the kind of thing that makes automated evaluation so difficult for natural language generation. So in the work that I'm presenting today, I do tend to think of NLG mostly in terms of this sort of data to text transformation, but in the literature, in the systematic review of the literature that we did, we were looking at all kinds of NLG. So we also included works on summarization or simplification or suddenly those are the only two kinds of NLG I can think of, MT, whatever you name it. If it was in there, it was included. So automated evaluation is extremely difficult. Human evaluation is viewed as more reliable. And you can see this in how it's consistently been a presence at INLG. So this is a figure taken from one of our papers looking at these 20 years of papers. And you can see that in some years, almost half of the papers have human evaluations. You see a bit of an upward trend, but also, you know, in the past few years, the number of papers submitted has dramatically increased as well. But so human evaluation is still, it's very much a part of what the community values. It's seen as a gold standard, but it's also complicated. So one way that human evaluation is complex is that we have many different names for the same thing. So you don't need to be able to read this figure in detail so much as what I want you to get from it is that we've got a many-to-one mapping here, and in some cases also a one-to-many mapping. And on the left here, we have names that were used by authors in papers referring to things that they were trying to evaluate. And on the right-hand side, we have a sort of taxonomic label that we use to group things together. So one of the things that makes human evaluation difficult is you and I might both be trying to evaluate how useful our system is in a particular context, like for a particular task or an information need. But if you call your evaluation metric dialogue efficiency, and I call mine, say, subjective success rate or understanding behaviors or recall of written materials, we may be talking past each other and not realizing that we're actually trying to assess some aspect of the same underlying construct. And so human evaluation is complex, not just because of the task and the difficulty of, you know, having references, but also it's made harder by the confusion in how we communicate with each other. So this was the sense that we had at the start of this project, and we really wanted to get a clear idea of the lay of the land. So what is the state of the art for human evaluation? So we undertook a systematic review of the literature and started by saying, okay, we will focus on papers submitted to the main conference on natural language generation. So the idea here is that by focusing on INLG, and in earlier years also ENLG before the two events merged, we are focused on what are people who are focusing on natural language generation doing for their human evaluations. Of course, there are good NLG papers published at ACL and EMNLP and other venues as well, but this is a core selection criterion just to sort of reduce the search space for us, right? Because even 600 papers is quite a lot. So for that nearly 600 papers, I did an initial selection looking through all of them manually and looking for keywords and checking the methods sections by skimming, trying to identify papers which seemed likely to have human evaluations. And so here I was aiming for high recall rather than precision, right? I wanted to ensure that I filtered that nearly 600 papers down to a manageable number, but captured all of the papers that included some human evaluation. And then finally, last year, as we brought together this team to work on this project, we looked at those 217 papers more closely and confirmed that 165 of them indeed have human evaluations. And so that 165 papers sampled over this 20-year period is what I'll be discussing throughout the rest of the talk. So this is how we started trying to understand the current state of the art. For our annotations, we came up with three primary categories of properties of the paper we wanted to assess. So first, we wanted to make sure that we annotated the system properties themselves. So just capturing basic facts about what kinds of systems are being evaluated. So the examples that I'll be showing here are from a 2004 paper by Porajska, Pomsta, and Melish. So in their work, they were generating English from raw or structured data, producing multiple sentences, and the task, the application they were focused on was dialogue turn generation. So capturing these details is just sort of helpful metadata for us, right? When we want to, if we want to look at trends for, do people working on dialogue use more of this, target this criterion more than that criterion, or other sort of subsets or cross tabulations of the data. The category that that relates most to the example I brought up earlier, the talking past each other, in terms of the qualities of the text that we're assessing, the second category had to do with these, the quality criteria. So the first aspect of this annotation was to understand what text property, what aspect of the text quality are the authors trying to evaluate? What do they claim they're evaluating? And then also trying to assess what did they actually evaluate, right? Because they might say, oh, we're assessing fluency, but then they define it in such a way that it seems to us like they're actually measuring something else, right? So for this, we captured both the verbatim name, so whatever the authors called it, and whatever definition they gave, if they gave a definition, as well as our sort of normalized criterion name and a best effort paraphrase that was, you know, not really standardized, but is more a way for us to wrap our heads around what were the authors assessing here. And then the third category of annotations that we captured had to do with the operationalization. So how did they turn that criterion into an experiment?
Oops. Looks like maybe Dave's computer has crashed, so I hope he'll be back in a minute.
Oh,
maybe if you show them, I can tell you, but I'm not
sorry.
very
I thought I
describing.
had it shared. So yeah, here.
I think this one was the great. I think it was 9. Yeah.
9 on the operationalization.
Yeah, this is something you were just starting to talk about.
Oh no. Okay. Well, cool. I got a chance to rehearse my talk a bit for free.
Yeah, so if you can start with this one.
Yeah. Okay. Now it's slow on my end. Can I just tell it to start presenting from here? Aha, there we go. Right. So what I was saying was that we had these 3 categories of three areas of properties in the paper that we were trying to annotate. So I already talked about the system properties and it's doing it again. I hope this doesn't freeze again. So we talked about the system properties and the quality criteria. And part of what we wanted to see as well was, okay, well, when these papers actually gave these 2 human participants, what were the humans asked to do? How were they asked to do it? And what kind of data did we get out of it? So here in this example, the authors didn't provide the exact question or prompt that they gave their participants, but they did provide, so we could only paraphrase what they, what we think they asked. There we go. And then we could say, okay, well, they used a rating scale to do it, right? So in this case, it was a numerical scale. It wasn't, you know, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we observed that it was, you know, 1 through 5 rather than say -2 through +2. And the data that resulted from this then was ordinal data. So not necessarily interpretable as continuous, but definitely having a rank. And then we also had a free response area for annotators to capture any kinds of statistics. So descriptive statistics, measures of central tendency and variance, like the mean and the t-test, or like the mean and standard deviation, sorry, as well as significance tests that they might have done. So, of course, annotating these three categories with 10 different people, we needed some annotation guidelines, right, to get us all on the same page, make sure that we were using our own terminology in the same way, in a consistent way. So what we did there was we we tried to capture the most frequent labels based on our sort of initial glance at the papers categorically. So we would have a drop-down menu with things like dialogue turn generation, summarization, simplification, these different tasks where the NLG system might be deployed, as well as having a separate other category that could be used for anything that was too infrequent or whatever that we didn't think to record a label for it a priori. So this figure at the right, you're not meant to be able to read any detail on that. I hope you haven't been trying. This is meant to give an example of the care that we put into our guidelines with respect to the quality criterion. So there were more than 200 different criteria names given across these 160 odd papers, right? So more criteria named than we had papers. But after developing this taxonomy, we're able to reduce this to map this onto rather 71 normalized criteria. So this is the difference then, right, between 200 verbatim names, the things that the authors said that they were evaluating, and our normalized view of those criteria. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, assuming that Zoom doesn't freeze again. Our takeaway from this annotation process, there's one major point that I want to get across, which is that there are a lot of basic details about the research that are just missing, and even just defining the thing that people are evaluating. So basic information is missing. So most papers do name what they intend to measure, but they also omit the definition for the thing they're evaluating. So this figure here makes that point visually, right? So on the left, we have whether a paper had all of the names, some of the names, or none of the names for the criteria they were evaluating given. And then on the right, we have the same thing, but for whether they gave a definition for all of the criteria or not. And so this is really startling, especially because we took a very relaxed view of defining things, right? So like we didn't penalize people for doing something like, say, citing previous work and saying, oh, we use the same definition as in that shared task or the E2E challenge or whatever. If people provided a reference and said, oh, yes, we're using that definition, that counted as providing a definition. So this is really startling that there's this basic information missing. And this contributes to the confusion that we see in the field, because the same word gets used to mean a lot of different things. So looking at the mapping from an observed criterion name given by an author, namely fluency, and the different normalized criteria names that mapped to, what we saw was that fluency sometimes meant fluency, sometimes just meant the goodness of the outputs in their own rights, other times meant something like readability. But those are the easy cases where it's just like a terminological difference. The more complex cases are these ones where they're actually defined in terms of multiple other constructs. So for example, one paper actually defined fluency in terms of coherence, human likeness, and the quality of the outputs. So the fact that we're using the same term to mean different things is, I think, a pretty big problem, because say Andre and I are trying to compare notes on systems we're developing, and we say, hey, I found that adding this feature or doing this to the data really improved fluency a lot. if we have different notions of what fluency is, then we might think, oh, well, geez, you're just pulling my leg there. You're selling me this yarn about how this is going to improve my fluency, but I don't see it improving fluency at all, because it's not improving what I expect it to be improving. This also ties back to the point that I made a few slides ago, that there are many different names for the same basic criteria. So there's one name used for many different things. There's many names used for the same thing. And if we were at least providing definitions in our papers or citations for definitions, like say, oh, we use the same definition of grammaticality as used in, such and such experimental syntax work, right? Then we would at least be grounded in these discussions. Sorry, did someone say something? Okay, I thought I heard a sound.
Just go ahead.
Yeah. So that's not the only thing that we found, right? So that's sort of the headline that resonates with me, that we have a great terminological confusion in our field. But this was a rich data set, right? So we can pull out some more findings to share with you here. And the data is also publicly available. So also you can go and dig through it and see what you can find as well. One thing that we observed was that there were 50 cases where a paper combined 2 to 4 different criteria in a single question. So here you're giving a prompt to a participant, say a crowd worker evaluating your text, and you say, hey, I want you to tell me, is this natural and grammatical, right? And so because you're asking them both of these at once, you might be trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? Just try to get people to really assess both at the same time and like interpolate in a meaningful way. But what happens quite often is that some of your users, some of your evaluators will focus on the naturalness, others will focus on the grammaticality. And so what you end up with is a mixed bag of judgments that aren't necessarily comparable even from the same question. So this basically just adds noise to the distribution of results that you get, because people are actually responding to slightly different questions implied by the prompts that you gave them. We can also comment on the most common methods of elicitation. So direct quality estimation, where you say, here is a text, please tell me how good it is. That's the most frequent form of elicitation. The next most frequent, unsurprisingly, is relative quality estimation. So if I give you 2 texts and ask you to judge the relative quality between them. There are other methods. So there are things like behavioral measures or interaction-based measures, but those were much less common. We can then also comment on what kinds of evaluation criteria the community is most interested in, right? So what things were showing up most often in papers. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we're generally interested in whether or not the things we're building are useful. And we would like to know that our texts are grammatical. And I think, these kind of make sense also. So a priori, you want to build something that's useful, but grammaticality, I think, is an interesting choice because it has, a very technical sense, right? But I think for folks coming from a computer science background, especially, most of the time it's just like, oh yeah, this is like correctness. Is the text broken or not? And yeah, it's kind of seen as the easiest way, I think, of achieving a consensus judgment for a text. But in contrast with that, the second or third, depending how you want to count, most frequent quality criterion is this totally underspecified quality of the outputs. So this is like where you just say, how good is this text on a 5-point scale? You don't provide any context. You don't say what aspect of the text you want people to assess. You just say, how good is this? That I can imagine use cases where that's fine, especially like if, say, you're like deploying a system with end users, right? Like in a real world use case scenario, you might not be interested anymore in understanding at a fine-grained level, is our system improving X or improving Y, but you just want to know, do the people using our system like it? Is it good enough, right? In those cases, it makes sense. But I think when we're trying to do science, to better understand how to generate natural language texts, this sort of underspecification is a bit of a problem. We are also, as a community, interested in how understandable a text is, as well as how correct is it relative to the inputs. So I don't think the fact that these are highly ranked would be surprising to anyone. But the big standout to me here is that this hugely underspecified quality criterion is the most common. So the key findings, I would say, from this paper, so this is the 20 years of confusion paper we had at INLG, is that there's little shared practice in human evaluation of NLG systems, and that reporting in papers is rarely complete. So it would be easier for us to have shared practices if we were all saying clearly in our papers exactly what we're doing. And then we could say, ah, yes, I'm doing what they're doing, or, ooh, I'm doing mostly the same thing, but I actually disagree for theoretical reasons or empirical reasons on this point, so I'm doing something different there, right? But this lack of clarity makes comparability and reproducibility really difficult for our field. So based on our experiences with this and trying to make the world a better place, call on ourselves and each other to do better when it comes to reporting, we provided some recommendations in our paper. I won't read this out to you. You can pull it up in your own time, but basically you might also look at this as a bit self-serving, right? We were interested in properties of the system, properties of the evaluation criteria, and the operationalization. And so since that was difficult for us for this annotation task, we now want everyone to do better, just a bit of finger wagging. But I think really, like, if you think about it, the reason we chose these categories, right, is because these are sort of core to understanding a paper's contribution to the field. We need to know what problem you're trying to solve and how you expect your system to work. What does it get in? What does it put out? We need to know what property you think is important. What are you trying to assess? And how do you define that? Because your definition might differ from mine. And then in terms of just good scientific practice, right, for the operationalization, we need to know what your methods are, how you're doing your experimental design and stuff. And I know I'm using you a lot here. I'm not referring to any of you, of course, personally. I mean, like, the general you, the community. We need to report these things so that we can build on each other. So that's a lot about the sort of problems in the field. How much time do we have? How long does the time slot last?
I think you still have definitely half an hour.
Okay.
Even
20
more.
minutes, I would say.
Okay, cool. So that gives me plenty of time then, despite the technical difficulties, to talk a little bit more about the work we did developing a taxonomy and that. So this is detailed more in the Bells, Mill, and Howcroft paper from INLG, but the two are really closely related. So here, I want to dig a little bit more into comparability and how we can figure out when two papers are comparable. So we've already seen that quality criteria vary a lot. I want to get into this in a little bit more detail here. So we developed a taxonomy that's based on the type of quality criterion, what thing is being assessed, what the object of assessment is, and what it's being assessed in reference to. So is it in relation to itself or something external? And of course, details about the methodology matter as well. I was already alluding to this on the previous slide. So this taxonomy begins with the looking at the type of quality criteria. These don't necessarily have to be ordered. These are kind of three orthogonal dimensions of a quality criterion. So the first one, the type, has to do with, so one type of quality criterion is a correctness criterion. So in this case, it's possible to state a general rule for when an output is maximally correct. So this is, I think, similar to the grammaticality case. So you can say if there are any grammatical errors, it is then it's not maximally grammatical. But if there are no grammatical errors, then then all grammatically correct texts are equally grammatically correct, and they're at this optimum. This is a little bit in contrast to a notion. So we distinguish here the goodness of a text. So here, there's not really a single mechanism for saying, this is maximally correct. So you might be able to say, for example, if I give you two texts and say, which of these is more fluent, they might independently of each other both be fluent, but you might still be able to give me a judgment for one being more fluent than the other in a particular context. So this is the distinction between correctness and goodness, that for one, you have this, that you can clearly define a sort of maximum and optimum. And then aside from both of these, there's a sort of feature-based quality criteria. So a text could be more or less X, but depending on the context, we want it to be more or less X. So an example of this would be like specificity or complexity, right? So if I'm trying to do a summarization, or I'm trying to say condense information for a domain specialist, for a subject matter expert, right? Then actually, I don't want to make things too simple. I want to keep it at a high information density, as opposed to, say, if you're trying to simplify the news for primary school students, in which case you really do want it simplified. So basically anything else that doesn't clearly fit into this correctness or goodness can be thought of as a feature-based quality criterion. So this is the first sort of dimension. Then we ask ourselves, well, what is the thing that's actually being assessed here, right? So is it just reliant on the surface form of the output? So this is something where grammaticality, you can measure grammaticality independent of the content, right? So I mean, choose your favorite colorless green ideas, sleep furiously example, right? Or the Jabberwocky or equivalent examples of things that are nonsensical, but grammatically correct, right? On the other hand, you can have things where we only care about the content, just the meaning matters. So there are many cases where accuracy can be thought of this way, as only relying on the content. And then, of course, there are the cases that rely on both, where you really need both to assess it. So it might be something like appropriateness, where you want to say, how appropriate is this utterance in this particular context? The third dimension then is the frame of reference. So we could assess, the form or the content or both, but are we assessing just that output on its own? So just looking at the text, or are we assessing it relative to the input? So this is really common if we're trying to assess the semantic accuracy of something, right? Like in the examples I had on my first slide, where I had a meaning representation and several ways of realizing it. You would want to know what was the input, so that you could see if all of that input is being expressed and only that input is being expressed. And then there are also evaluations which rely on an external frame of reference. So the sort of, I think, best example of this are the sort of factual accuracy assessments, where you're trying to say, this would be more common if you've got a system that does content selection as well, right? So like in summarization, if I'm trying to do multi-document summarization, it's entirely possible to imagine that the system ends up, including only content given in the inputs, but still creating an implicature that leads readers to draw a false conclusion. So the factual accuracy requires this reference to some external, world knowledge, individual knowledge, knowledge base, something else. And so similarly also, for appropriateness, as I was talking about on the previous slide, it's usually, appropriateness only makes sense in context. And so there you have an external frame of reference, not just, say, the input to a dialogue system, but a whole conversation up to that point, or the relationship between the agent and the user. So this results in a taxonomy with these 27 different combinations. So we can categorize different criteria based on, these 27 combinations, these 3x3x3 properties. So for example, over here under goodness, of both the content and the form in its own right. So category 16 here, we have readability, fluency, understandability, clarity, and non-redundancy. So these are all slightly different measures of related ideas. They do definitely measure different things. I'm not trying to say that they don't, but this taxonomy helps us to figure out which things should we expect to be more comparable or more correlated with each other compared to other things. So thinking back to the factual accuracy example, right? That has to do with the correctness of the content relative to an external frame of reference. And so that would be different from the normal sort of accuracy measures like the slot error rate that that Andre and I used in our paper with Verena a couple of years ago, where that would be the correctness of the content relative to the input, as opposed to relative to an external frame of reference. So this helps us to begin to tease apart all of these different categories. So this was a sort of essential groundwork to trying to figure out how do we wrap our head around these dozens of different quality criteria that people are assessing. Of course, the mode of evaluation differs as well from one paper to another. So in this paper, the Bells et al. Paper, we highlight 3 modes of evaluation. So objective versus subjective, where you're trying to do something based on observation and quantification, or relying more on subjective judgments or opinions. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on at what point annotation shifts from being a subjective thing to an objective thing. We're going to, focus on the extreme cases here for this distinction of objective versus subjective. There's also whether the evaluation is absolute or relative. So do you assess just one system in itself in an absolute kind of way, or do you assess it either implicitly or explicitly in comparison to others? So you might do this implicitly by saying, having text assessed one at a time, but from multiple different systems, so that people's judgments are influenced by the quality of the text they've seen from other systems, right? So whether it's an absolute versus relative mode of evaluation, as well as whether it's extrinsic versus intrinsic. So are you actually deploying a full system? Are you doing a sort of end-to-end evaluation? Or are you focused on, say, individual components measured or assessed independently? So we just want to know about the grammaticality of the text. We don't care about whether that actually makes the system, helps users get their job done. And naturally, experimental design also varies. So I've got a whole list of dimensions of experimental design on this slide, but I don't actually want to talk through them because my voice is starting to fade on me. But it's a lot of the things that you would just think, especially hearkening back to the things I was calling out earlier, things that need to be detailed in our papers, and that by detailing them, we make it possible to see, oh, okay, you're using a different statistical inference method, but otherwise we're using the same techniques. Should I switch to your method? Should you switch to mine? Are they both valid for different use cases? Or, hey, I want to use your survey, your questionnaire as my form of evaluation response, and but I'm going to change the scale. So I'm going to use a sliding scale instead of using a Likert scale or something like that. Excuse me. Right. So the point of this second paper was to detail all of these dimensions along which evaluations can vary. So the 20 years paper gives us these comprehensive annotations, and the Disentangling properties paper gives us a set of, based on what we've learned from that, here are a lot of dimensions that need to be considered when we're reporting our work. So now the natural question is, what do we do? What do I do? What do you do? Where do we go from here? And so I'd say in experimental design, we want to stand on the shoulders of giants rather than reinventing the wheel. And maybe we feel a bit awkward calling, our peer researchers giants, and we want to reserve that for talking about, the long ago linguists and scientists. but then we can look at it more as an act of solidarity, right? Like we are all doing research in this space, and by working together, making our materials available, using similar experimental designs rather than saying, well, I've thought about this for an afternoon. This seems reasonable. I'm going to do this. If we instead say spend a few days looking at what other people have done and then try to do something similar, or hey, maybe someone's done an evaluation that's exactly what we want to do, and we can just change the items that are being evaluated, then we can increase comparability in the field. So I think this is one thing that I would say before we start collecting data, right? We can look at what each other are doing. And then when we've done our experiments, my big takeaway from this annotation effort, just as an anecdote, after all of the months of looking at these papers multiple times, it was still taking one of us half an hour to complete all of these categories. So I showed these tables on screen before. Completing those tables for one paper was still taking half an hour, when that's the only thing you're trying to do. You're not trying to read through the paper comprehensively or anything. You've done all of this training. You know what the annotation guidelines look like. You know what is often reported where, and it's still taking that long for experts in NLG to extract this basic experimental information from a paper. That seems wrong to me, right? It should be really quick to look at a paper and assess, oh, okay, yeah, that's relevant. That could be comparable to me. That I might want to reproduce that work or not. I think that documentation and maintenance are undervalued research outputs. So I want to acknowledge that as well. I'm here telling you how important documentation in your papers are, but also when you're releasing a data set and you're releasing your code, maintenance on that is also important. Even if it's as simple as like, oh gee, I don't know, say GitHub decides to stop being free for everyone. Now we need to actually shift everything over to Clarin or the institutional library or somewhere that actually has the purpose of being archival, right? Or you could be more responsive than that to bug requests and stuff. But these are really important parts of doing good science. And I think we can also do more as a community to encourage and reward this behavior. So I'm a little bit optimistic looking at things like the open science initiatives, which I'm most familiar with as being a big presence in psychology, but they are sort of all over in the natural sciences these days. And I think that you can see where communities have banded together to try to make sure that people are getting credit for their work. So for example, folks developing software packages for R for doing different kinds of statistical analysis. At some point, a group of people got together and said, let's create the Journal of Statistical Software. And now, when they take the time to develop a library that gets used by people, they actually not just have that library that's useful for them and for others, but they can keep their bosses happy, keep the publication counters happy by saying, hey, here's a journal publication explaining the contribution of this work. So I think there are things that we can do potentially as a community to try to encourage, create space for that kind of reporting that is undervalued. And also, if you're on a review committee for someone's grant or a job application or whatever, you can also try to make sure that their efforts are recognized when they're doing these things that don't show up as much in publication counts. So that's my little rant about what we can do as a community there. And then kind of a little bit coming back to this experimental design element, but thinking about when you're writing it up in the paper, we can try to use existing guidelines and resources to make sure that we're providing all of the information that other people need and that we're doing it in an accessible format. So of course, I'm going to push the sort of guidelines that we were giving in these two papers, right? Our initial recommendations and the sets of dimensions that we think matter when you're reporting a human evaluation for NLG. But there's other similar things out there that, depending on the nature of your research, might be more relevant to you. But by using something like the machine learning checklist or model cards or the data sheets for data sets for our outputs, so it's a useful tool for us, right? Because we're all too busy. We have too many projects. We have too much going on. and it's easy to forget one detail about that would make our work more reproducible for someone else. So it's a convenience to us to have a checklist, right? And then it also helps ensure, if we're reporting things in a somewhat similar format to each other, that makes it more accessible to other researchers, right? So in some fields, like in some medical journals, you have this practice of breaking the abstract apart into, what's the research question, what were the methods, what were the statistics, like what stats did we run, what were the results, what are our recommendations based on this? And they actually, at the abstract level, break down papers like that, so that then, when you're wading through this mountain of literature, it's easier to find what's relevant to your work. So I don't think we necessarily need to go that far, but I think it's good for us to think of this kind of accessibility of the research that we're putting out. How easy is it for someone to spend 2 minutes looking at a table in our paper and our abstract and take away at least the knowledge of whether it's relevant to a project they're doing now, or remember it later and say, oh, you're telling me about that new summarization project you've got. I remember this paper, they did a similar thing, and refer things to other people as well. So at the end of my title, I ask a question, right? I say, Quo Vadis, human evaluation, where are we going? From my repeated calls to document things more, you might think that I'm a bit pessimistic about the state of affairs, but I'm actually quite optimistic about where we're going. So there's been a huge explosion of interest in human evaluation, not just for NLG, but NLP more generally. In this in this neck of the woods, right, in NLG at the main conference in 2019, we created a mailing list, which led to a little workshop. And both of these papers resulted out of the collaborations that were formed by proxy of that. And several other good research outcomes have come out of that. So it's nice to see that bearing fruit. There was also a research a workshop at Johns Hopkins last year where they were focusing on specifically evaluation of dialogue systems and trying to do some standardization of even just at the data set level, right? So if you want to develop new evaluation metrics or methodologies, it's helpful to have a large collection of data sets in a consistent format, right? Like this is the kind of thing that Hugging Face with their data formats is also making, trying to make data more accessible to people as part of their workflow. There's this new shared task challenge trying to evaluate the accuracy of text from the NLG group in Aberdeen. There's the HumEval and ReproGen workshops. There was the Evaluating NLG evaluation workshop at INLG last year. And there's this large effort to develop a kind of benchmark for generation called the Generation Evaluation Metrics, I think is what GEM stands for. It's a good name. And it's meant to be a bit like glue, but for NLG. So provide a sort of one-stop shop for evaluating your system against multiple benchmarks at the same time. So I'm quite excited to see where all of these initiatives lead. And I hope that your next paper also contributes to improvements in human evaluation. So the things that I've been talking about today, these are some links to the papers and the data set. You can find me on Twitter, where I probably spend more time than I should, at _DMH. And I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention, for bearing with me through technical difficulties. And yeah, I'd love to take some time to discuss and answer questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dave, for your leadership. And I think, at least I hope, there will be several questions for some particular point.